to present our last speaker for today. It's Mr. Jonas Himmelstrand, and Jonas is perhaps the most internationally well-known critic of Swedish family policies today, based on his book that was published in 2007. He's spoken in more than a dozen countries, including Swedish and British and Irish Parliament, and at the UN in New York. He lives in Finland after being forced to leave because he's homeschooling his children, which is illegal in Sweden. And he's now going to hold his essay or his on family developments in Sweden, a critical view of Swedish family policies. So welcome, Jonas. We're looking forward to listening to you.
It's a great pleasure to be here, a great honor to be here at this conference. Somehow it's very special to be at this historic event. It's kind of like the first of its kind you get the sense of, and I think you can all feel in here that it's the beginning of something new. That is at least what I feel when I sit here and listen to all the presentations I've heard here. The United Nations say that family is the key group in society for growth and well-being, as we heard this morning, especially for children. And the presentation that some of you heard yesterday and this morning has confirmed the science that supports this statement. Now, Sweden is often hailed as the family policy model for the world to follow. And wherever I go in the world, they say, oh, you come from Sweden. Oh, you've got this perfect model. You've got it all figured out. What haven't you? So, of course, we want to know, is the Swedish family policy model actually successful? And we also want to know, is it in alignment with the United Nations statement? And that's basically what I will be talking about. I worked most of my life as a management consultant, a profession which is obsessed with human potential, which doesn't necessarily mean that we understand how to do it, but we're obsessed about it. But eventually you come in contact with children, and also I met many parents in my work as an educator in business and public officers, especially unhappy mothers, who just spontaneously told me, I feel so bad leaving my 1-year-old in daycare. At that point I had my own children who were at home, and we were having a discussion in Sweden about the great sick leave among Swedish women. And I was started asking myself, is there a connection here somehow? I found a book by an American author who had done a meta-study of all research on health, and found out that health factors like not smoking, eating healthily, doing exercise were important indeed, but there was one health factor which was more important than all other health factors combined. Good, close relationships. And that kind of brought something in my head. Are we having problems with relationships in Sweden? Is that the reason why we have this sick leave? Just, about half a year later came the report about psychological health declining. And I was starting to ask myself here, my children were demanding at a young age. And my wife and I, we intuitively choose a very family-oriented approach, which is probably in Finland now. And it seemed to be diametrically opposed to what the Swedish government recommended us to do. And it was personally quite stressful to go against this tide, although our children did quite well. So I asked myself, Sweden is one of the richest countries in the world, with a comparatively evenly distributed wealth and a mild social security. Why then are Swedish children suffering from so many psychological ailments? Why do they do so poorly in school? Why are Swedish parents so often on sick leave? And why do they find parenthood so difficult? Sweden should be doing better than anyone else. Why not? Now, a lot of you already know the answers here, but I'll present them to you and you will start to understand this. At first, I didn't want to get involved in this because I was looking in the media and I saw that people discussing childcare and gender equality. They got into trouble, they were being beat up in the media, and I thought, no, I'm not going to get involved in this discussion. And I was kind of like, I'll just stay as a management consultant. That's more safe and protected. You don't have to be seen so much. Then I saw a saying in some magazine by Martin Luther King, who said, we start to die the day when we no longer talk about what's important. Say it again. We start to die the day we no longer talk about what's important. This went straight to my heart, and I realized there wasn't really any escape. I had to dive into this somehow. And I did that, and 5 years later I came out with this book, which I published in 2007. It's 613 pages. It weighs more than a kilo, which means that's why I don't bring it so often. But that's how many pages it took for me to clarify myself on this. Being a Swede and growing up in a country which I felt was just going away from me and me going in another direction. I was asking myself, is it me who's wrong? I was going through my entire life, or is it the Swedish mentality that's wrong? My conclusion after 600 pages was, I'm not the one who's wrong. I wrote the book in Swedish, and I realized later that this is the biggest mistake in my professional life. The Swedish audience is just simply too small to contain a book of the content it had. I should have written it in English directly. But I'm working on an English translation of the key parts of it. Now that I know that I'm right, I don't need to use 600 pages to get it down to 200. And it's my daughter who drew the cover. She drew it in 15 minutes. She was 7 years old. She was very proud of it. And it's her picture, of course, of the family she's living in. And she's 16 years old today, and she's just waiting to draw the cover for the English book. So this is a family conference, and we should have a picture of the family. This is my family from the first winter in Finland after we moved 3 years ago. The Nordic climate is pretty brisk. It's minus 15 degrees centigrade here. As you can see, I have a very tall son. It's me who's on the left there. Basically, my motivation for this comes from the family. It's easy to think when we stand up here that we're talking from a lot of studies and reading and so. Yes, we are, but the basic ideas and instinct that I wanted to find out, basically I got my instincts, and then I read the books to find out, are my instincts correct? And my scientific mind eventually proved my instincts, and I was happy. So let's start to look at what statistics has made Sweden so famous as the true social utopia realized. And you've all heard about this. Sweden has the lowest infant mortality in the world. I think one other country equals, but the lowest in the world. We have a very high life expectancy. Not the highest. Japan is a bit higher, but still it's very high. We have a relatively high birth rate by European standards, 1.7, 1.8 children per mother of fertile age. We have very low child poverty. We have only half of the average in the European Union. We have a comprehensive daycare scheme that is admired all over the world. Come to that later. We have among the highest education spending of any country in the world. We spend a lot of money per pupil in our schools. It's among the highest in the world. We have a gender equality, which is also admired in the world. And we have the famous 16-month parental leave, which leads people to believe that this is the most child-friendly country in the world. So let us look now at the Swedish family policies of today. I just put some of the main ones in here. In Sweden, there are no babies in daycare. I looked at the statistics a few years ago, and there were 4 children in all of Sweden under 1 year of age in daycare. Probably they were 11 months and a week or something like that. So the parental leave means that we have no babies in daycare, and yes, let's give Sweden an acknowledgement for that. But then something happens very quickly. At 18 months of age, 93% of all children are in daycare. So the door, which is opened by the parental leave, closes very quickly. And the push in Sweden to do this is very hard to explain to someone who doesn't live in Sweden. I've heard mothers tell me about you go to the medical checkups, and when the child is 9 months old, they will ask you, so you have enrolled for a place in daycare, I hope. That's very important for your child. One mother told me after going with her 18-month son, so is your child in daycare, they asked. She said, no. Well, you have to do that, you see. He needs to go to daycare, and you need to work. And this is so prevalent that I think, you who are not Swedish, you can ask any Swedish mother or father in here, they'll tell you how you feel nearly bullied when you started walking around with a 2 or 3-year-old midday in Sweden and why are your child not in daycare? And of course, we can discuss the reasons for that later. Daycare is very low cost in Sweden. It's subsidized by 16,000 euros per year per child. So we put an enormous amount of money into this. I shared that figure in the Irish Parliament, and the parliamentarians looked at one another and smiled. We can't afford it, they said, and they were very happy about it. There's no natural home care allowance. We'll talk about home care allowance later. There is a home care allowance in 1/3 of the Swedish municipalities, which means we can give the smallest sum of about 300 euros per month before 3 years of age of being home. There are some rules about this, but this is not on the national level, and the present government, which came into power a few weeks ago, said that they will abolish them because it's a threat to gender equality. There are no home care tax benefits, so that if you're a dad supporting a family of 3 or 4 home children, you pay the same amount of tax as a bachelor who doesn't have any children at all. There's no acknowledgement of the fact that you are raising children. You're expected to put them into daycare and to work full-time. So daycare and dual earner households are encouraged both financially and culturally. If you look at the subsidy of daycare and you look at how this works, you will see that a one-person earner actually pays more in tax in absolute terms than a dual earner family using daycare for 2 children. Home care, granny care, and neighbor care are culturally discouraged. Even child minding today is discouraged. And you saw Professor Wallenström's here. They went down the child minding because they are not pedagogically trained. Someone is considering that pedagogics is the key thing for children to develop, completely contrary to what we discussed this morning. And home education is in fact illegal, which is unique for Sweden and Germany. In most of the Western world, homeschooling is possible, and that's the reason why I live in Finland. Not going to talk so much about the quality. Professor Wallenström talked a lot about this. You know that the daycare group sizes have increased. Often for the small children, it can be 17 children or more. And when you look into the details of this, you will read that if somebody is sick, which happens quite often in a daycare center, so they're not there, they're not replaced by a standing person, but there'll be 2 persons taking care of 17 children. And in one book, 3 Swedish experts say there can be a situation where 1 person is alone with 17 children below 3 years of age for several hours. And of course you realize, that's not possible to give even the most elementary form of care. There's no regulation of group sizes or child-staff ratios, and what makes Swedish daycare famous once, that was it had a focus on play. And if you look in the 1980s, there was actually a focus on play in Swedish daycare. Now, of course, it's not that easy, but then the group sizes were smaller, like you saw, there were more personnel, but this is now being replaced with a focus on learning and pedagogy. And if you think a bit here, you realize if we introduce pedagogy and learning and instruction and structure, we can have more children and fewer adults. So that's probably the prevailing. And our local politicians now are talking about the same things like, we have to find other quality measures for daycare than group size and child-to-staff ratios. Now, that is quality in daycare. That is quality in daycare. And the reason, of course, is there's not the money to pay for it. I asked the question at the meeting, this political meeting this summer, and I just said, it seems like we do not have the money politically to put into creating a daycare of the quality that would be good for children. And nobody could really protest that, and that seems to be a fact today. When the state has taken over the daycare to this extreme, it comes in a situation where parents are dependent on it, and it's become a political issue among many other political issues. And it just cannot, the political system does not be able to handle this in spite of good intentions. Yes, and several Swedish psychiatric experts have said that the quality of Swedish daycare is now at the point where several children will get disturbed by it. They will have their development impaired. Of course, this was not the vision of what was going to happen. The vision in the Social Democratic Women's Program of 1972 was this. They were going to implement a daycare program, and it was going to achieve greater gender equality, it was going to improve child social development, it was going to improve child academic development, it was going to level out the social class differences, it was going to liberate mothers from their motherhood instincts. That might sound a bit crude, but it is actually in effect what it says. It pictures motherhood as some kind of an addiction that it's important to get mothers out of before they get stuck into. To manifest the work policy, which is kind of the religion in Swedish politics today, both sides of the political spectrum love this. That is the idea that every single adult should be in full-time work and every child or one should be in daycare. And that is supposed to give happiness for everyone. And when men and women have exactly equal wages, the picture portrayed in the politics of Sweden is then nirvana will come. So the ambition was to achieve greater adult life satisfaction through more employed work and less family work. So, in a way, you can see, you saw the studies here earlier that Professor Waldenström showed. 35-year-old studies of children groups which were about 100 to 150 children. And you could of course argue that with the 30 years of this, we have several 100,000, if not even millions of children who've gone through the system, and this has had some effects on development. Now of course this is not a carefully done scientific experiment, but I'm anyway going to show you what does it look like, and what has happened today in these respects. How does the situation look like right now? And all the facts I'm showing you here are all verifiable in public sources. Actual outcomes 30 years later. We see a strong increase in self-reported psychological ill health in our youth. This is discussed enormously in Sweden. It's a cause of great concern. It's a triple in girls between the 1980s and 5 or 10 years ago, and doubled in boys. It's an enormous increase. The critics then say, but this is self-reported health. Couldn't it be that they just simply, express themselves more now? What about the diagnosed psychological health? Well, same there. There's a strong increase in diagnosed psychiatric disease among youth, and suicides are, like mentioned earlier, at a high level. And this is in all the public reports. You can read about this. And if you want to know, is there a real life to this, you can go into any Swedish school, sit down with the teacher and talk to them and say, how are they doing? They'll say, a lot worse than 20, 30 years ago. A lot worse. A lot more difficult to handle school class today. A lot of the time goes to handling personal issues in the classroom, and sometimes there's only 10 minutes left for actually teaching kids. Plummeting educational results in our schools. There's a PISA study, and quite a blow came a year ago when the latest PISA results come. The PISA is an international studies where they compare the results, school results for 15-year-olds in many countries. And Sweden hasn't really recovered from that yet, because we've gone pretty much from one of the top countries in 30 years to become one of the bottom. And the latest PISA study, we were at the bottom of the developed OECD countries. Now the critics said, well, this was kind of these knowledge things, Our children are good at being creative because we have such good social training in our schools. A few months later, PISA came out with these studies where they asked the 15-year-olds to solve problems which did not require knowledge, but was rather a reflection of how well they could think. And Sweden was again at the bottom. Now they say, well, this is the PISA. They don't really know what they're doing. They were trying to say in Sweden, because this is a pride of Sweden. Sweden can't have this. We are supposed to be the social utopia. But then the Royal Technological Institute in Stockholm, which is one of our most famous universities, I studied chemistry there once, they did a diagnostic test of their entry-level students starting the first year in mathematics, about how they were doing. And they said, it's disastrous. We cannot see how many of these pupils are actually going to manage this course. Many of them are at the 8th or 9th grade level in their mathematics. It's like they haven't learned anything in the last 2 years. And since then, it's been accepted that Swedish schools are at a disastrous level. Not only that, but if you look at another study, the TIM study, it shows an increase in discipline problems in Swedish schools. And again, there Sweden is among the worst countries in Europe, with the greatest tardiness, difficult behavior, truancy, and bad mouth in the classroom. And even our former Minister of Education acknowledged this, that Sweden has among the worst climate night classrooms. I'm going to do something about it. But I understand nothing has happened in these 8 years he's been in charge of this. And he was criticized for this by many. It's not that bad. But then the Swedish Ministry of Education came out with a research saying, yes, it is actually that bad. We have high rates of sick leave among women. A study did a few years ago in the Karolinska-Institutet, one of our most famous universities in the medical sciences, did a study on women, and it was titled, "Who Can Work Until 65 years of age?" Not the women, half of them quit work life early. And at that time, the statistics showed also that Swedish women were on sick leave probably more than any other group of women in all of Europe. And they were trying to look into the results and say it basically seems it's not real health results, it's social problems that they have. And this is, of course, the first generation of women who have been pushed into combining children and work life. And some voices were said then, isn't it better that, parents have 10 years with children and then they can work 10 years longer? We would get a lot more women. Daycare staff is one of the top 3 group in the sick leave statistics. And if you think of now the idea of attachment, how important it is, a child maybe finds a person in the daycare center that they attach to, but chances are big they'll be sick one day, or they will quit because they feel burned out and they'll find another job. We have a deteriorating quality of parenthood as well. There was a study, an EU-sponsored study done by a Swedish woman a few years ago, and she was interviewing various groups to try to get a picture of the quality of Swedish parenthood. And she said it's striking that today, even well-to-do middle-class families don't seem to be able to read their child's needs. They don't seem to be able to set limits. And her conclusion was, it seems like Swedish parents are interpreting the situation as the raising of children is now done by preschools and daycare and schools. They do not think that is their responsibility anymore. And if you talk to Swedish teachers again, they will confirm this view, that it's a problematic. It seems like many articles say that Swedish parents have kind of let go of parenthood and let it be taken care of by the state. Quality in Swedish daycare is decreasing, as we've talked about. Neither have the gender equality managed to be done by these policies. British professor Catherine Hakim, she did a study on this, and she says Sweden has the most highly segregated, gender-segregated labor market of any country in the whole world. She compares Sweden to Saudi Arabia. That is that women work primarily in public jobs, in school and in care, and men predominantly used in the private industries and in higher managerial positions. Now, we have a government which is equal. 12 ministers are women and 12 are men, but behind what's being shown on the surface, it's not as good as it's often claimed to be. We also have a very high youth unemployment, which is higher than many other countries, and this is sometimes cited as the reason for the problems in Sweden. And it's kind of interesting, if you take a critical view on this, we're taking the parents away from the small children to go and get jobs that they take away from the older children. So we kind of do it in 2 ways. We take away the parents from the small children, and then we take away the jobs for the 18 to 20-year-olds so they don't get into the labor market, which would be their next stage of growth and development. So, if I have a real critic here, it doesn't seem to have it here, but if you have a real critic here, they will ask, well, is there a causal link? Are these outcomes I've just listed, are they somehow linked to the Swedish family policies, which basically want to have all 1-year-olds in daycare from that on, and encouraging men and women to go out and work full-time and so on. Of course, you can never prove this. This is nothing that can be proven in any way. And the more I read about this, I realize that the amount of variables are so huge that this is never going to be proven either. It's going to have to be a hypothesis. I studied the NICHD study that Professor Waldenström referred to, And that study has cost $150 million. That's 1 billion Swedish krona to do that study. And still, they say that we maybe did not manage to capture every single important element. So you can see what kind of study would be needed to prove this. So we're just going to have to look at the probability of something. Also, if you don't want to hear what you saw on the last page there, you can just look at this. Okay, it's obviously we've got problems in Sweden with our youth. What would be the solution? Let's forget about why it happened. What would be the solution? And looking what you've heard at this conference, you realize the solution is more adults in the children's lives. And not only adults, but more adults that the children are attached to. So it comes to the same however we look at it. So here are some possible causal explanations. Well, I can say here, the reasons, the picture I showed you here before, this one, what's special about this picture is that I don't know anyone else who put all these outcomes on one slide. You will have a discussion about the psychological health. That's one discussion, it has its own reasons. And then you'll have a discussion about the school results. That's a completely other discussion with other reasons. And you segment these two so you don't combine them. So I think the only thing that's unique in this is I put them all on one page. And of course, when you look at the importance of relationships for growth, you kind of see, there's a combination factor here. This is all relationship related, every one of these. It does indeed seem like Sweden has a problem with its relationships. Some argue that they say, well, the reason for this development is that Swedish teenagers have so many choices today. Others say it's because of the high youth unemployment. And others say it's a general societal development that is doing this without actually going into the causes of it. And if you look at this critically, you probably will say that if you have a fully mature person, fully mature 15-year-old with all of their factors of growth relatively intact, they could probably manage the choices. They could also probably manage the fact to have the confidence to find a job. So it might be very true, these reasons, but it's probably not the whole reason. As for schools, it's blamed on teachers not being trained enough, or not having high enough salaries, and about the municipalities not giving the schools enough money, although we spend more money than any other country. Now, you may have heard about Finland and the success of their schools. They pay a lot less money for their schools than we do in Sweden. Women's sick leave is basically blamed on men not helping with the household chores, although when you look at the statistics and you combine the hours that men work and men do things at home, and then the hours women work and women do things at home, you find that actually the men work more. One study many years ago, which was quickly quieted down, was about the attempts to divide the parental leave into 7 months for the mother and 7 months for the father, because you want to make it more equal. And everybody believed the men don't want to do the job. The men are bad; they don't want to do the job. This is the women, who need to be helped here. But the study showed that it was all about the women wanting all the 16 months. That was the basic reason why men did not take more of the child care allowance. And of course, we've had discussions in Sweden about this. In one political debate, those who argued for splitting the parental leave so that the mother could only take 8 months, and then the father could take the next 8 months. And if the father couldn't or didn't want to, well, the kid would have to charge daycare at age 18 months. And one political leader said on TV, well, there are breast pumps, for the breastfeeding. Now, that is going a bit too far. Even in Sweden, that politician, a man-politician, he got a lot of criticism. Even the journalist interviewing him was asking, what do you mean? So there are limits also in Sweden. So, we're not going to do the politically correct guessing now, but I'll just, you've heard a lot of the possible causal links there from Dr. Neufeld, and I'll just make a summary of the possible ones. I'm not saying that one is more correct than the other, but you can see there are lots of them. Possible causal explanations. Well, one of the first I read about were those who said that there's which you also heard from Professor Waldenstern, that the cortisol levels go up in the stress in daycare. And in somebody called the classical attachment theory, that this corresponded to those having an insecure attachment. these higher levels. And actually that as the brain is being actually formed physically by the caring it receives the first 2 years, then this could be chronic low stress levels for life. That means that you're going to get stressed and feel anxiety for lesser reasons than somebody else would, which would correspond with a lot of the witnesses we're hearing from Swedish psychotherapists. They say, I get so many young people who are anxious for relatively small things. Another reason could be what we've heard here yesterday and this morning, that early exposure to a large group of peers creates peer orientation and emotionally defended children. There are too many children in the groups, there is too few adults, and the children will not stand being on their own, so they will connect with one another. And as children are small, not mature, they're not always going to be nice to one another, so they're going to hurt one another. And there's no one to go to, and if it's many hours, they might not even get the rest at home, or if the daycare is of poor quality, the children get defended, and you've heard this morning what that can lead to. Then, the whole developmental process can be arrested. I mean, you think of a day, I just heard this example told by how a day can look for a Swedish 10-year-old. They get up early. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the parents leave the 10-year-old off at the before school activities. They're there for an hour and a half, then they start school. They're already hungry and they're already tired. Then they've got school till about 11 or something. Then they have lunch. Then they go to school till 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Then after school in the afternoon, then they go to after-school activities. The parents pick them up at 5 or 6 o'clock. And if it's really ambitious Swedish families, there will be an activity in the evening as well to promote their cognitive development. Now, of course, you realize for a 10-year-old, you're on your own without your parents from 7 in the morning to maybe 6 in the evening. It's just simply too long. So you're going to try to look for someone in there during those hours that you can connect to. And if you're lucky, you might find some reasonably nice person. If you're really lucky, you find a teacher. Otherwise, you find a friend. If you don't find, you find a group. And you're going to get hurt there, and there's not going to be a space to feel that through, and that's going to be a cause of real trouble. Emotional defendedness lowers the children's teachability and sets the stage for psychological problems of various kinds. I'm fortunate to be able to teach Dr. Neufeld's teachability factor in Swedish for Swedish teachers. And when Swedish teachers hear this, they just nod, yes, exactly. And they feel so happy to realize that it's probably not our fault. It's probably not the school's fault. But the school requires functioning families to deliver the children who will actually learn. And that's just not happening today. I remember when I went to school, my mother would say me off in the morning, and she would actually go to work. So I cycled with my friends to a little school, and we picked flowers for the teacher. I remember the teacher, she wasn't very nice to us. She would spank us with a ruler on the hand sometimes. She would misbehave, but somehow we still respected her. We were obviously attached to her. She was reasonably nice. There was no bullying I can remember. And we cycled home across, and I went to my grandma, and I was debriefed by my grandma over the school day with some chocolate with some nice cinnamon buns, and had a good time. And after I talked to her, I went out and played with other children, and then my parents came. I think in such a setting, school can actually work. And of course here, all of the parents knew one another. So I knew all my school friends, who their parents were, and everything. It was kind of connected enough. This was in the early 1960s. Peer orientation leads to this interest in learning, bullying, gangs, flatlining, culture, and promiscuity. You can read about all this in Dr. Neufeld's book, Hold On To Your Kids, or in Swedish, Våga ta plats i ditt barns liv. It's quite a thing when peers take over the education of each other rather than the parents. It's a Lord of the Flies scenario. And of course you realize with the attachment dynamics, once you attach to your peers, you're going to push away the adults because they're different, they're another world. And then you can understand the issue we sometimes feel with our teenagers who seem to be more friends or more close to their friends than they are with their adults. The culture of early separation of infants from parents causes stress in parents and possible sick leave. I mean, this is just my notification of all the parents I've met, especially women, sending their 1-year-olds to daycare and hearing them talk, how stressed they are about this. I mean, how can you function at work when you're sitting there wondering how your child is doing in daycare? One more stress factor on top of that, and you're going to be sick. Large state intervention in family life reduces parents' sense of responsibility in their care for the children. And I think you can see that quite strongly in Sweden, how the state has moved in, and it seems to be a vicious circle, because the state moves in, the problems increase, the state says, oh, we have to move in more, and it increases even more. Let's make it a little more positive here. So this is, I've had to educate often people who are not Nordic to the differences here. You see, this is Sweden here. That's Norway. This is Denmark. Those three countries are Scandinavian. Now the Nordic countries, then you add Finland and Iceland. That's got the Nordic countries. Now in the Nordic countries there's something called the home care allowance. And we're going to look a bit at that. It's hardly used in Sweden, and it's politically pushed down in Sweden. You do not use this, it is bad, it is really put down, very few use it. But if you look at some other countries, so in Sweden has had this since 2008, it's been taken away now by this government. It's used by 1/3 of Swedish municipalities. And a comparative Nordic study showed that in Sweden, the home care allowance, where you get paid a small sum for your children up to 3 years of age, is used for 2.5% of the Swedish children. In Norway, it's used for 27% of the children. So 27% of the children, the parents use the home care allowance to either be at home themselves, or have grandma be home, or aunt at home, or a neighbor or something. But they organize it themselves in a setting that they feel is good for their children. In Finland, it's used for 56% of the children. This means that whereas the norm age for starting daycare in Sweden is 1 year of age, in Finland it's 3 years of age. Now, in the psychology of children, as at least Swedish psychologists tell me, there's an enormous difference in the psychology of a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. A 3-year-old has much more in common with an adult than it has with a 1-year-old. So you can then ask yourself a little test here. Based on what you've heard so far of this conference, which country would you expect to have the best school results based on the information you're giving here today? I live in Finland since 2 years, so I can definitely say there that you feel a very, very different culture. I live in a Swedish-speaking part of Finland, Åland, where everybody speaks Swedish, and it still has Finnish culture and Finnish legislation. It's quite strong when you go on the streets in Mariehamn, the capital there. When you go in Sweden, you will seldom having a teenager deferring to you when you walk past them. They will either just completely ignore you, or they will make a little face at you somehow. In Mariehamn, when you walk there, when you have a teenager coming next to you, they look down. And when we discuss these things here, you get suddenly, I asked here, who was here, yes, in Finland, we do not have an opinion about how you have your family life. You make your choices. And it doesn't seem that anybody's affected that you use home care or use daycare. That's the family's choice. She explains, we've got so many other problems in Finland, so we haven't got time to even deal with that. And when a recent discussion in Åland about they wanted to modernize the family policies in Åland, I got a bit worried about that. And so one thing we have to do is we've got to improve the home care allowance. So you realize it's a completely different culture. My wife is a violin teacher and a music and piano teacher. She has had pupils in both Sweden and Finland, and she says it's so lovely to teach the children in Åland because they're so much more present, so much more teachable, and such a great pleasure to be with. So before I finish here now, just some. I've got 7 minutes left. Current Swedish family debate, just to give you a sense of what's going on here, because I think this is the way, if you're not Swedish, that you get a sense of what kind of country this is. Well, you know about the alarm rates of schools and sick leave, I've told you about that. We're discussing now not only daycare, but night care, and weekend care, and summer care. This is a political debate we're having, whereas, well, what about the parents who work a night shift? Shouldn't they also have care? Yes, of course, we have to have night care. And what about weekends? Somebody works there too. Yes, we should have weekend care. And some just think it's very difficult to take care of the children in the summer when they're home, so why don't we have summer care as well? So this is kind of the discussion we're having. It's been suggested by some politicians that we should have compulsory daycare from the age of 3. Now, compulsory in Sweden means that the police will come and get you if you don't send your children there. What's the argument used? One of the top politicians in the last election said, daycare is a child's right that no parent has the right to hamper with. Now, that's kind of like, we talked about children's rights here, that I think is a completely incorrect interpretation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. But this is what's used in the Swedish political debate.
What is not hamper in Swedish?
Hamper, mästra med, konstlade. Det är ingenting som svenska föräldrar ska ha någon rätt att kunna lägga sig i. Daycare is encouraged also when parents are on parental leave. You're encouraged to have your child in daycare when they get a sibling at home. Because after all, they will say, it's in daycare that the child has his friends, and also he'll need the pedagogics, and he needs the social development things. Unemployed in Sweden have to have a place in daycare for their children if they're going to get unemployed benefits. Because the argument is that if you get a job, you have to have a place to be able to go out and work. And basically, it's simply pushing people into this. Gender neutral pronouns, you've heard about that. We've got preschools in Sweden who interpret the curriculum, and it's accepted to do that they take away he and she and introduce a gender neutral pronoun. And then they also introduce gender neutral toys, so they take away the cars and the dolls because they believe that gender is a social construction and we will achieve gender equality if we don't make any comments about gender. This has been reported in some magazines. And this is in alignment with the Swedish curriculum on preschool. Daycare and gender equality has become a Swedish ideology. So, my final slide here. What are some reasonable learnings from this? Obviously, you could do a lot more research on this, but you could also keep it simple and say, you know, why introduce something in another country which hasn't proven to work? I mean, we cannot say by any measure that we know that the Swedish model works. There are many indications to that it doesn't work, and if we apply a developmental perspective on it, we can quite easily understand why it does not work. So, it seems to be a well-supported hypothesis that Swedish family policies have led to negative developmental outcomes for children, parents, and families. The basic reason for the negative development seems to be that individual childcare has become a state political decision based on political ideology rather than a parental decision based on the needs of the individual child. And I think that is the thing. We're not talking about, the HARO is not talking about taking away daycare. We're talking about that it has to be the choice of every parent. Every parent feel that they have to feel through what does my child need, and the state saying, we're neutral, we'll support you whichever decision you make for your child. Every society has to protect parental choices about the care of their children. The state should stay neutral to all forms of care, including home care, and not be supporting one over another, culturally or financially. The institution of family needs support and respect from government, as family is the key institution for close relationships in the Western world today. Some people say in Sweden that family is not important anymore. I'd say that nuclear family is incredibly important because it's all we got left. It's all we got left in our culture today. We rather have to see if we can't expand it in the way that we've discussed earlier at this conference. Work for the good of society needs to be acknowledged. Raising children is certainly one of them. It's certainly one of the things that's good for society. Everybody who brings up a child brings up a taxpayer. And in Sweden, that's a lot of money. Women sometimes make different choices than men. Their choices are highly valid and worthy of respect, which is true gender equality. Swedish family policies are not sustainable. They need to be researched and understood in depth before any attempt to emulate them in any way is done. So I see I've got 2 minutes here. I can show you the last slide here. Just to be a bit on the hopeful side, if you ask some of the parents in this room here, those of you not from Sweden, you will realize that there are those who are trying a different way. There are those parents in Sweden who see that childcare is at least 18 years, not 18 months. And they see that during those 18 years, we will certainly be equally engaged, both mother and father. They are the ones who see that mother and father are equally committed during the entire childhood, but they realize that the early home care will be by the mother, supported by the father. I was a very ambitious father until I realized that I just don't have the connection with my children that my wife had. You know? Why is that? And I realized I hadn't carried the baby and I don't breastfeed the baby. You know? I can be very, very ambitious, but I can change the nappies, I can carry them to sleep and all that. And I remember there was an enormous understanding that came to me personally when my children began to be 2, 3, 4 years old, when they kind of realized that daddy was a real person and not just a deluded mother. He was a person with his own feelings, his own energy and all that, you know. And there were years there where I felt they attached to me in a way that I felt I was absolutely essential to them. I added something that their mother could not do. And that's just a beautiful dance, as Gordon would put it. Conscious father care growing from 2 to 4 years of age. Strong emphasis on strong child-parent attachment. At school age, many mothers start their own business. And I think there's a wonderful book written by an American journalist, Anne Crittenden, called If You've Raised Kids, You Can Manage Anything. And in a sense, from that book, you get the idea that the ideal is for mothers to have the children young, you raise them, and when you become 35 or 40, then you can get your education, and then you're ready for quite a career with a lot of knowledge and maturity inside you. And I think then we can kind of see, she argues there that it seems to be that being a mother for many children is what truly mature a woman's brain. She goes so far to say that, you can say that it's good. It's a beautiful book. Family
What was her name?
Anne Crittenden. If you've raised kids, you can manage anything. She compares it to management training. You know, being a parent is equal to a high, very expensive management training. You will get all the things you learn in the management training just simply being a parent at home. Some families even home educate their children, and some of you know that this is a strongly growing paradigm in the whole world, and if you look at the results there, you'll see that they do at least as well as the school children, which kind of disproves the whole argument about preschool. If children not going to preschool and not going to school at 16, 17 or 18 years of age give better results in schools, well, that indicates that there's an issue somewhere and it's not about the family. These families are large. They often have 3 to 6 children. They're often large families. And these families, in my experience, they tend to stick together and rarely divorce. Okay, so I hope I've given you some ideas here. I hope you can walk away with the idea, no, Sweden was not a successful social experiment. We need to try something else, and you've gotten some ideas from that. Thank you.